slave quarter, and other African American sites. An artist friend in Leesburg emailed me to inform me that a building once used to house slaves was only a few miles from my house. She had seen the 18th century stacked stone structure. She thought it was my kind of image, and she was right. So began my search for other quarters and ultimately other African American sites built during the Jim Crow era. After joining in on a series of tours of African American sites in Loudoun County, I was introduced to many images. I also visited the historian at Mount Vernon, and he gave me access to his list of all slave quarters still standing in Virginia. Trips to North Carolina, Georgia, Louisiana, and Florida completed my series. Lincoln, Virginia. When I first came upon Grace Church, I thought of the book, A Secret Garden. It was so beautiful in its quiet way. A trustee of the church kindly met me in Lincoln to unlock the door and allow me in. We carefully walked around the floor because it had openings. The roof has openings that let in light at odd angles. When I finished painting the painting, I saw pictures in the water-damaged walls. Grace Church has an organization fundraising to preserve this beautiful building built by newly freed Black and Quakers. Carver School, Purcellville. Constructed in 1948, the first modern elementary school for African American children in the area. It was built adjacent to the Emancipation Grounds in Purcellville. I'm so happy that I was allowed in while there still was this aura of a school, because now it's a thriving senior center. I was told that this Lovettsville cabin was once a holding building for slaves waiting to be picked up by new owners. Settle Dean Cabin, South Riding, Virginia. This is the cabin of Charles Dean, a slave of Thomas Settle. Upon the death of Thomas Settle, 142 acres and the cabin were willed to Charles Dean. Residents of South Riding wanted the cabin to stand as part of the history of Loudoun County. A highway was planned through the site. The residents worked with the developer to save as much of the cabin as possible and relocate it nearby. The painting is prior to the restoration and the move. Neighbors graciously gave me access to the cabin on their property, once used as a slave cabin. Press World, Virginia, close to the North Carolina border. Their slave quarter is a reconstructed one. While visiting a friend in Beaufort, South Carolina, we visited a summer home of a plantation owner, now a tourist site. The docent told me that buildings once slave quarters are now highly valuable. Former plantations, which are now historic sites and no longer have standing slave quarters, are looking to buy slave cabins to move to their site. Isn't that a strange irony? Louisiana evergreen cabins. These cabins still stand, 22 in their original double row configuration. I was unable to get into them, that's not allowed. And they all look like that, all 22 of them, from the outside. Laura Plantation, near New Orleans. Solderly Plantation, Hollywood, Maryland, which is in southern Maryland. This is their one remaining slave quarter. Ossabaw Island is off the coast of Georgia. Now it's a wildlife refuge. We were allowed to come over by boat, stay the night in what used to be a hunting lodge. The quarters were used for many years after emancipation by workers and had been somewhat modernized, but there were still paintings waiting for me there. Stagville, North Carolina. I prefer not to spend time going through manor houses, but in the case of Stagville, it was the one time that it only seemed polite to go on the tour, since the guide had been my contact and had been very, very helpful to me. When we got to the second floor, we saw a small room next to the master's room. It had a little crib in it, and it had beautiful light coming into the room. The guide told us that it is thought that the room was for the slave, his wife, and child, and the male slave was the master's son. The young man had been educated as a doctor. Eventually, the young family moved to Liberia, but they did return, not to the plantation. And this is a slave quarter there at Stagville. Oakley, Montgomery County, Maryland. The room is somewhat modernly furnished because an elderly gentleman had been living there until a few years ago, and after his demise, a museum was created. Kingsley Plantation, Jacksonville, Florida. The ruins of 23 of the original 32 cabins stand as reminders of the enslaved men, women, and children who once lived and worked on this 1,000-acre plantation. The cabin in this painting has been restored to its original appearance. Zephaniah Kingsley moved with his wife Anna, who was from Senegal, West Africa, and whom he purchased as a slave when she was 13. Kingsley freed her in 1811. When the United States purchased Florida from Spain in 1821, oppressive laws were enacted and conditions for Florida's black population deteriorated. To escape what Kingsley called a spirit of intolerant prejudice, Anna and their sons moved to Haiti in 1837. There, Kingsley established a colony for them and some of his former slaves. Oatlands, Leesburg, Virginia. All the cabins have been destroyed at Oatlands, but I was told that probably slaves lived above the little store. George Carter, the original owner of Oatlands, was one of Loudoun County's wealthiest men and largest slaveholders. He supported the institution of slavery despite his father Robert Carter's opposition and freeing more than 500 slaves. In recognition of the freedom seekers, Oatlands is now a site in the National Park Service's Underground Railroad Network to Freedom program. This is one of the first paintings I did of this series, and one with a rather shocking experience. I was told that there was a slave quarter on a farm in Lovettsville. I called the owner, asked permission to come on her farm, and she granted it. She agreed and told me where the quarter was. It was close to the farmhouse, and to come on the land whether she was home or not. She had dogs, but not to be afraid, they wouldn't bother me. Well, that did worry me a little. If she weren't home, they'd be on the closed porch. No one was at home, and I did not see any dogs on the closed porch. I walked to the building. The door was down a few steps. I walked down. The door was slightly ajar, and I couldn't open it further. So I pointed my camera to the light coming in a crack in the wall and took a few photos. I went back up around the building and started to take photos of the sun and the shadows on the side of the building. All of a sudden, I felt a slam into my chest. I looked around. There was nothing. I decided I think I better go home. When I began to paint this image, and I looked closely at it, I saw a shape that looked like a copperhead coming through the wall. Was I being told, don't come near this wall? I'll never know, will I?